I'd like to welcome you all to the 7th annual David Kessler Lecture in Gay and Lesbian Studies. It's very nice to see so many people here for an event that's always one of the most exciting and stimulating and frankly moving of our programming year here at Clags. I'm Jill Dolan, the Executive Director of Clags. I have a few opening remarks and introductions to make, and then Anne Pellegrini has a few words to say on behalf of the Clags board, and then we'll proceed with tonight's testimonials and tonight's lecture. I wanted to say that Frances Deegan Horowitz, the president of the Graduate Center, was unable to make it tonight. Usually she loves to open this event, and I know she especially wanted to be here tonight to honor Eve, but another commitment kept her away, but she does send her best regards to the occasion. I want to begin tonight by introducing the man whose generous gift makes the Kessler Lectures possible. David Kessler himself is here with us from San Francisco. Will you stand, David, so that we can recognize you and thank you? There he is. David is a San Francisco psychiatrist with a distinguished record of advocacy for lesbian and gay causes within the psychiatric profession. He organized and he was an early president of the Gay and Lesbian Caucus of the APA, a caucus now known as the Association of Gay and Lesbian Psychiatrists. I also want to say that I had the honor of meeting David personally for the first time this week, and I want to tell you that he's a warm and wonderful man who it was really a pleasure to meet, and he has a deep commitment to the field of gay and lesbian studies. I'm very glad that he can be with us here tonight, and I hope you'll all get a chance to meet him at the reception following tonight's lecture. I also want to tell you that 3 of our former Kessler lecturers are with us this evening. I can't see anyone at this point, but Barbara Smith is here. Barbara, do you want to stand up? There she is. Thank you. Esther Newton is also here. Esther, will you stand up so we can remember you? And Chip Delaney is also here. Chip, will you stand up? One of the nicest things about this event for me is really marking the history of the field, and it's very nice to have former Kessler lecturers with us to keep that process going. The Kessler Lecture, as most of you know, is the most prestigious event of our programming year at Clags, and it always seems the best time to publicly thank the people who make all of Clags' work possible. So if you'll indulge me here for a moment, I want to introduce these people to you, and then we can demonstrate together our appreciation for the hard work that these people do, and then you'll have faces to put with names that you're reading in your program and in other places. The first person I want to recognize is Marty Duberman, Clag's founder and first executive director, whose foresight and commitment and dedication led to Clags' establishment here at the Graduate Center nearly, believe it or not, 10 years ago. Without Marty's vision, without his pioneering scholarship in the field, without his connections to communities of people who saw the need for Clags to be called into being, we would not be the nationally prominent center that we are today. Marty, I know you're in the back somewhere, but would you stand up so that we can thank you? I want to thank Marty for his continuing support of Clags' projects, and especially for his own support of my work as executive director. It's been a pleasure to continue working with him. Our board of directors, who are really responsible for guiding Clags' intellectual and political commitments, you should know, are all volunteers who give enormous amounts of time and energy and thought to Clags' programming, to our fellowships, and to our increasing advocacy work. The current board is a particularly smart and wonderful, hardworking group of people, and I'd like to recognize them tonight so that we can all thank them. Will you stand up as I say your name, and then we'll appreciate them together as a group at the end. There's a few of them. Mark Balasius, will you stand up? Mark is currently working on our interdisciplinary PhD option here at the Graduate Center, and he's also participating in this spring's Rockefeller conference planning. Arnaldo, is Arnaldo here? I didn't see him. Arnaldo Cruz Malave, I'm very glad is here, has done a number of conferences with Clags and is also working now on the Crossing Borders conference that will happen in March. Paisley Cura, I know, is here. She is working on our advocacy committee, here she is, and is also thankfully developing our website, and for that I thank her quite a lot. Kay Diaz, is Kay here? There she is in the back here. Kay worked very hard this year to put together our colloquia series and also works with our fellowship committee. Lisa Dugan, hi Lisa. Lisa is working most actively right now planning this spring's Rockefeller conference. She's one of the primary organizers, and I thank her for that. David Eng. David is going to be giving a colloquia this spring and is also working on the Clags Fellowship Committee. Licia Filomata is also working as one of the organizers of the Rockefeller Conference and did a wonderful colloquia just a couple of weeks ago. Beth Freeman is the chair of our newly reinvigorated, thanks to her good efforts, Advocacy Committee. She's the chair of that committee. Manolo Guzman. Manolo is our new graduate student rep and is also very working hard on youth initiatives on our Advocacy Committee. Robin Hackett is, where's Robin? Robin Hackett is our outgoing graduate student representative, who we thank quite a lot for her work. Evelyn Hammonds couldn't be with us tonight, but she is a new board member. Suzanne Iasenza, are you here, Suzanne? She's on leave from the board right now, but it's very good to see her here tonight. Carol Kaplan, I know Carol's here, is the chair of the board, and I thank her for that, and does quite a lot of work on our development committee. John Keane. John is here, there he is, has also worked to put together this year's colloquia series and works very hard on our development committee. Art Leonard, there's Art, is on our fellowships committee and has done quite a lot of work in his 3 years on the Clags board. Martin Manalanson, thanks Martin, is the chair of the fellowships committee and has done wonderful work, especially with our Rockefeller fellowships. Doug Mao, Doug is here. There he is, also works on our fellowship committee and does a lot of work in conjunction with development. Oscar Montero is right now working very hard organizing the second Crossing Borders Conference after doing such good work on the first. Jose Munoz is the co-editor with Anne Pellegrini of Clag's series Sexual Cultures at New York University Press, and you'll be hearing more from Jose tonight. Anne Pellegrini is also the co-editor of that series, and you'll be hearing more from Anne tonight. And last but not least, Alan Yang. Alan is here somewhere. Alan is the chair of our programming committee and has done quite a lot of work over the years. Let us thank these people for all of their hard work. I just want to say personally how much I enjoy working with this board. They aren't afraid of controversy, which is important if you're going to be on the Clags board. Collectively, they've got a terrifically astute perspective on contemporary national and academic politics, which is also really important. And they have a host of inspired suggestions about future conferences and fellowships. So I just want to thank them publicly for the very hard work that they do. I also want to recognize the Rockefeller fellows who are in residence with us this year, Barbara Smith again, and Eric Clark, who's here. And Eric Clark. In addition to the richness of the research and intellectual work that they bring to our board, we really appreciate their input on programming and other board decisions over the course of the year. It's very nice to have them with us. Finally, I want to recognize the Clag staff. You know, Clags accomplishes quite a lot with relatively few resources. Only about 15% of our budget comes from CUNY's contribution, and the rest we raise through our membership campaign, through the generosity of our major donors, and from foundations and other granting agencies. So most of those funds go toward programming and fellowships. We have very little money then for our basic operational needs. That means that our staff is small, and they're forced to be creative with the resources that they do have. Our current staff is a wonderful team of people who I would say work as seamlessly as an ensemble theater company, and they always put on a terrific show. They also do really good parties, which you'll see at the reception immediately following the lecture tonight. They answer our phones, they send our mailings, they manage our membership drive, produce our newsletter, administer our fellowships, handle our email, keep our books and our accounts, and much, 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 much more. So if you would recognize with me Rachel Cohen, our development consultant, among other things. Rachel is over there. I told them that they had to be in the room tonight, so I hope that they are. They failed me, so no Heidi Coleman and no Jordan Schildkraut, but Jim Wilson is our videographer tonight and does many, many other things for Clags very well. It's a really, really great staff. Now, we've established a ritual at the Kessler event in which someone from the board does a pitch for Clag's membership drive that's geared from their own disciplinary base. Era Wilson, who I'm happy to say is here tonight, even though she left us to go teach at Ohio State University. Era Wilson, who's an anthropologist, did the first of these pitches 2 years ago, and with a rather ethnographic spin. And she inspired Anne Pellegrini to try one last year from the perspective of queer theory. Anne's pitch has since, I understand, turned into her own stand-up comedy act. Or perhaps it's a solo performance act, I'm not sure, which she's performed at Dixon Place here in New York and at various other conferences in the field. And since Anne set such a high standard at the talk last year, we've invited her back this year for a repeat performance of Clag's membership pitch. Anne teaches in English and literature at Harvard University, and she's the co-editor of our series with Jose. Please welcome Anne Pellegrini.
Wow, it's really hard to follow one's own act. But I thought, as Jill mentioned, last year I did my pitch from the disciplinary perspective of queer theory, an undisciplined perspective indeed, and this will perhaps surprise many of my friends and ex-lovers who are out there tonight, and you know to which category you belong, but I'm not bitter. But this year I thought I'd actually do the perspective from the standpoint of ex-gay. So this will be the ex-gay pitch for Clags, but of course to many of you queer theory is a very short step to ex-gay because we're so vanguardists we've dispensed with identity categories altogether. But you know, one of the dilemma I was thinking, ex-gay, I can't be consistently ex-gay, and then I realized that ex-gay, you know, discourse is not consistent either. In fact, and this is something I've learned from reading the work of tonight's honored speaker, Eve Sedgwick, homophobia thrives on inconsistency rather than on consistency. We might say that if a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, homophobia is a big brain indeed. And I was thinking, well, okay, so an example, and you know, my example is always provided to me by contemporary political comments. So I was thinking back to my great leader, Trent Lott, who certainly helped me advance my own ex-gay agenda. And if you recall, this summer, Trent Lott stood at the Capitol Rotunda and, you know, was pronouncing on the subject of homosexuality. He is himself a professor of lesbian and gay studies. And he was asked, you know, Senator Lott, or Professor Lott, I'm not sure which, do you think homosexuality is a sin? To which he replied, yes, it is. I'm quoting. I mean, such scintillating, I'm quoting. And then he went on to elaborate, but you still love that person, and you try to help them. I feel bathed in the warmth of this Christian compassion, but the fussy gay man trapped in this lesbian body, or maybe the English professor, and is it the same thing, is upset at the bad grammar. You still love that person, singular, but you try to help them, plural. But that's not what really bugs me. He then went on, after sort of describing homosexuality in the language of sin and moral evaluation, to analogize homosexuality, here using a kind of medical model, to first, alcoholism, second, sex addiction, whom has he been talking to, and finally to kleptomania. You know, I was stunned, but then I realized that this could be a really useful strategy for many homosexuals, because so often homosexuals, and I distance myself from that category being an ex-homosexual, but homosexuals are accused constantly of trying to steal the innocence of young children. They're kleptomaniacs. No. But my real task, you know, so anyway, if I'm not consistent, blame it on my formerly homosexual past, which I'm not still distant from, although I am trying to get Christ in me as often as possible. Now, what a single girl does for fun. So, actually, but really, in all seriousness, my real task this evening is to tell you a little bit from this ex-gay perspective about what Clags is. What Clags is. But of course, everything depends upon what the meaning of is. Now, as against the self-representations of many members of Clags, and remember, it is a membership organization, as against those self-representations that one is born a Clags member, I want to insist against all of these claims, these homosexuals, that Clags is a behavior-based identity. Clearly so. It is a membership organization. I want to give you a few examples of these behaviors which together constitute the identity known as Clags. And again, one is not born this way. It's important to keep that in mind constantly, because you too could fall into this terrible morass called Clags. Now, among many of the behaviors which Clag's board members are trying to encourage others to perform, and to perform so regularly as to naturalize those performances as their very selves. Right. These behaviors include, and hold on to your wallets, pulling out your wallets, pulling out a pen, and writing a check. Writing a check. Now, you can write these checks in any multiples of zeros. Now, I know that many of you right now are really focused on the Christmas season, not Hanukkah, because, you know, ex-gays aren't really interested in Hanukkah. But focusing into the Christmas season, which gives you a few more shopping weeks ahead. And you're trying to shop for that troublesome wife, mother, former lesbian on your shopping list. And you're wondering, what would she want? Well, you could give her the single membership to Clags, which would be $35, or you could write a check for the entire household so she can share it with her ex-drag queen of a husband. And now I know you're worried. You're thinking, but if this literature comes into your home, isn't this one of the ways in which Clags members recruit? Exactly. But, and this is where I think this is actually a really good test for ex-gay Clags members. The literature comes into your house. You are so above it. You glance at it, but briefly. And maybe you go to some of the many Clags events that, you know, you're told about in the newsletter, such as the Rockefeller Conference, which will be happening this spring. It will be a marvelous conference. Or maybe you sign up for one of the seminars in the city, which is meeting once a month down a different light. I've just finished a unit on queer theory. Thank God I'm almost finished. And in the spring, there'll be one on lesbian and gay histories that Martin Manalanson is teaching. You can even show up at one of these events. But so strong is your will, so strong is your determination that you've come into contact with the heterosexual you always already were, that you listen to what's said, you even raise your hand, you ask questions, but you are untouched by it. You resist the behavior, even if you may be a member. See, there are all sorts of ways in which you can both participate and yet not be under the sway. That is to say, we love Clags members. We just don't want Clags members always to act like Clags members. And you can also, if you're really nervous about this, you could just write us a big old check, right? But then do nothing else for the rest of the life of that membership. That would be fine too. Now, I bet you're sort of wondering, so how is it that someone becomes a Clags member besides the check writing? Are there other forms? Well, there's this thing called recruitment. Now, many people have gone astray in college or graduate school, or even at a later turn in their professional career. They start to, I don't know, they read Foucault and then they're off the deep end. Or for some of us, they read Ovid and they were off the deep end. But I want to suggest that this recruitment could actually be an opportunity, because we could bring more and more members into Clags, and we're actually in the midst of a huge membership drive. All the better to ask people together to join and resist, resist, resist. And I hope you'll join with us in making this Yuletide gay. And join with us too in perhaps supporting the new fellowship initiative. The life of the Rockefeller is fairly short, and we are in the midst actually of a big drive. We're hoping that lesbian and gay studies scholars and queer theorists can help us bring together new fellowships for other lesbian and gay studies scholars and queer theorists, so they too may see the light, may see the horrible tragedy of their ways. So please, if I could ask you to join hands and pray with me. Or better yet, if I could ask you to reach deep, deep, deep into your pocket and pay me. Thanks very much.
Thank you. And clearly not enough work is done on the conjunction of comedy, theory, and money in gay and lesbian studies. So I want to thank Anne for sending us in ever new directions. Finally, I want to end this opening remarks by saying just a few words about upcoming programs at Clags. I want to refer you to our calendar of events, which is on the table out in the lobby, and just highlight a few things for you. Our colloquia series continues each month through April, with 1 or 2 lectures by people in the field who want to share their work in progress for smaller, more intimate gatherings. I always enjoy these as they allow for dialogue and exchange in a way that larger conferences sometimes preclude, so I hope you'll join us for some of those. In March, we'll be staging the second of our important Crossing Borders conferences, sponsored by a generous bequest from the Michael C.P. Ryan estate. This year's Crossing Borders will focus on testimony, autobiography, and self-figuration in Latino, Latina, and Latin American literatures. A number of distinguished international Scholars, writers, and performers will be coming to speak and share their work, and I hope you'll join us for that. And finally, at the end of April, we'll be presenting the second of our 3 Rockefeller-sponsored conferences. This one is called Local to Global, Activists and Academics Think Toward a Queer Future. This year's conference will be solely plenary sessions, organized as roundtable discussions, all of which will focus around a series of important questions about the state of gay and lesbian and queer politics, locally, nationally, and globally. I think it promises to be a really stimulating 2 days of meetings and conversations that will really help to further Clag's mission to stage continuing conversations among activists and academics. I do hope you'll join us for as many of those events as you can. Now, I'm happy to introduce tonight's 7th annual Kessler Lecture in Gay and Lesbian Studies. For those of us who have participated in the development of our field and watched it move from a scrappy, extra-institutional pursuit inspired by queer street activism to perhaps a more established, respected part of the academic curriculum, depending on where you work and how you think about those positions, we know how important Eve Sedgwick's role has been in this growth. Thanks to her inspiring and provoking scholarship, thanks to her experiments with forms as well as with the contents of queer thought, and thanks to her extensive personal commitments to students and scholars in the field, queer theory has become an intellectual force with resounding influence across academic disciplines and across social movements. Eve, as you know, just recently joined the faculty of the Graduate Center here in the English program. I'm personally delighted that this year's Kessler Lecture honors one of CUNY's own faculty, and I'm very moved that we're all here to honor Eve's crucial contributions to queer thought. Let me introduce the first of tonight's 4 speakers. Jose Munoz teaches in the Performance Studies Department at the Tisch School of the Arts at New York University. He's the author of articles that have been published in the journals GLQ, Screen, Social Text, and Women and Performance, as well as several anthologies of critical theory. He's the co-editor of Pop Out, Queer Warhol, and Every Nightlife, Culture and Dance in Latino America. He's also co-edited special queer theory issues of the journal Social Text and Women and Performance, and he is the author of Disidentifications, Queers of Color and the Performance of Politics, which is forthcoming this May from the University of Minnesota Press. Welcome, Jose.
Hello. So, I'll just start. Why did I have to follow in Pellegrini? How did that happen? So, as Monday rolled around, high panic mode set in. I knew that tonight was 5 days away. I had not written a word. I've known about this testimonial for a while, and I think that after being honored by Eve's invitation, I immediately started sweating. I sweated this one in ways that were unfamiliar to my current jaded old professional persona. The freakiness has to do, to some degree, with talking in your own backyard to your friends, but this was only a tiny part of it. The real panic has to do with this. How does one honor and speak to a person who has left and continues to leave such a powerful imprint on one's scholarship and life? I had to think about that a lot. Well, for starters, I could go the sappy, sentimental route and have a lot of feelings. I could basically write a love letter to the teacher I've adored for almost 10 years. If I thought about Eve, I knew she would like it if I roasted her a little, teased her in my ever-so-loving way. I could always talk about how Eve's mind is one of the most powerful and twisted engines in all of creation, how it reads, how it shows the errors of some of the ways we were taught to read BE before Eve, how this mind produces edifices of knowledge that we can call theories, how these theories illuminate queer worlds. I could get all institutional and talk about how her work shaped this crazy little thing called queer theory. If I was really at a loss for something to say, I could always succumb to my fierce sense of Eve defensiveness and go off on some of her extra stupid attackers, but that is the easiest sport, so I won't be doing that tonight. Sleep easy, Donald Morton, wherever you are. In the end, I decided that with the exception of that last option, I would pull from each of the columns, mixing and matching. But before I came to this conclusion, I sent a panicked email out to some of my friends from graduate school. I was hoping one of them would give me the magic key to this little speech. Nobody did, but they all said some great things. I want to bring in some of their voices, knowing that they'll mention some of the things I would otherwise miss. The first to respond was my friend Gus Stadler, who's now teaching in Pennsylvania. He and Eve have the shyness connection. He told me about the time Eve took him to a bad Mexican restaurant in Durham, and there are only bad Mexican restaurants in Durham, I assure you, and offered him some valuable ways to work his shyness. He explained that, quote, "In the end, I'd come back to that weird hodgepodge of things she bestowed on me and on you and others. As amazed I was by the practical stuff here, there's the abstract fact that she taught me how to honor shyness. Not just say, therapeutically, it's okay that I'm shy, but also to see it as a real source of fucking power. As a strategy, as a way of making people listen to you. Gus's point let me picture, in my mind, the ways in which this queer woman with a very small, cracking voice and a blushing presence manages to completely fill up a room in ways that really throw off the usual suspects, voices that seem to never crack and feel all too comfortable with themselves. This is certainly one of my favorite things about Eve." Then Jennifer Doyle wrote in from Virginia, and she responded with characteristic creativity. She outlined a children's book about Eve. As I read the following lines, take out your imaginary crayons and draw the matching pictures. Quote, "Eve is a big panda. She lives in a tiny apartment. Eve writes. She weaves. Eve makes Sculpey. Eve is a big nerd. But many, many people love Eve anyway. Sometimes she is nice. Sometimes Eve is really mean. She is always shy. But don't let this fool you. Eve is a superhero. Eve's weapon is a brain ray. She uses it to make room in the world for you and me. So don't fuck with Eve." Please notice how both Gus and Doyle use the word fuck. What are they telling us? What about Eve inspires students to talk dirty? Then, from elsewhere in Virginia, Jonathan Flatley chimed in after I sent my second wave of homosexually panicked emails. I know I'm not using that phrase in the proper Sedgwickian fashion, but you know what I mean. He suggested, quote, "Say something about flamboyance and courage." He ended his email with something like a strange Morse code message. He tapped out, "Boldness, pleasure in boldness. Pleasure and politics can go together. They must go together, in fact. But politics doesn't mean moralizing high groundism, and taking risk. The importance of taking risk, intellectually, yep, those things." I know you're thinking, what is she going on about? But those of us who have lived near Eve's presence, her writing, and politics strangely get a lot out of this mumbled code. The key word for me is pleasure. Eve has helped me never lose track of pleasure, its place and its role, and how things get really boring when we don't track, own, deploy, relish, and even honor pleasure. Most importantly, she's taught me how the best thinking is intractably attached to pleasure. Queer thinking is a thinking that never loses sight of pleasure. I eventually heard from Katie Kent in Williamstown, Massachusetts, who reminded me of a lot of great things. Most poignant for me was her mention of pedagogy. Quote, "In terms of pedagogy, remember how she attended our first panels at that Rutgers queer conference? She came to both our panels and sat there and nodded and was ready to kill anyone who dared attack us. She would have probably killed with her aforementioned mental death ray, her weapon of choice. Finally, Mandy Berry called me from Providence, Rhode Island. She wanted to make sure to mention that Eve is weird. She is weird to talk to. She's a low talker. I think that's a Seinfeldian term that I myself am not personally familiar with. and a long pauser. Mandy's teasing comments made me think about how talking to Eve, not unlike reading Eve's prose, takes us by surprise at first, then becomes a beautiful thing. It demands careful listening and extra careful attention while reading, and it rewards this extra attention with insights and visions that shift our paradigms in the most productive of ways. Talking to Mandy was bittersweet because it made me want to call my friend Brian Selsky, who passed away last year. Brian was a beautiful mad genius child who loved to cook. I think Brian would have said something about how Eve's brilliance inspires us, and then he would have made sure that I mentioned what a good dinner party guest she is. How she'll eat seconds. As she does so, pleasure radiates from her face. She will often insist on helping with the dishes, no matter how much one protests. Brian loved feeding Eve. And then there's me and the question of sappiness. One of the many beautiful things that the Epistemology of the Closet does, and it does a lot of beautiful things, is the way that it tells a story about how sentimentality is rehabilitated by gay men. This culprit of a signifier does not only get rehabilitated, but it also gets totally refurbished. It becomes newly inhabitable. The Epistemology of the Closet makes the world a place that we can comfortably call home. Here's a sentence about what sentimentality does for gay boys. It's a fat, gorgeous sentence. I would dare say it performatively echoes its own object with drama queen-like tempo and intensity. Quote, "The kid in Ohio who recognizes in Somewhere Over the Rainbow the national anthem of a native country, his own, whose name he never heard spoken in constructing a new family romance on new terms. And for the adult he becomes, the sense of value attaching to a private realm, or indeed to expressive and relational skills, is likely to do with a specific history of secrecy, threat, and escape, as well with domesticity." Judy Garland does something for that boy in Ohio, makes links and bridges to another place, a place that is intimately connected to its active negation in everyday life. I don't want to make Eve into a Judy like diva. She's never been so spunky. Her highs and lows are, shall we say, less pronounced. And she's hardly a boozer. But I do want to gesture to the knowledge she produces, and I want to suggest that it broadcasts to a lot of queer people all over the world. And in this way, the knowledge she makes is like an absolutely essential song. It broadcasts a fierce sense of possibility, a sense of possibility that has helped so many of us to imagine a field, a set of theories, and it provides us with a sumptuous optic. In Eve's thinking, is Eve's thinking the national anthem of queer theory? No, probably not. I don't suspect she wants it to be anyway. But it does do something, perform something. Eve's work and all the performances that constitute her work clear a certain space for you and me, like Jennifer said. For many, it does that. It does more than refurbish this time and place. It goes further. The knowledge that Eve Sedgwick makes for so many queers of all stripes enables a rich world of thinking, thinking queerly, thinking through, and with pleasure. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Cindy Patton. Cindy teaches in the Graduate Institute of Liberal Arts at Emory University. She's been active in AIDS politics and cultural criticism since the early 1980s. Her numerous writings on the epidemic include Sex and Germs, The Politics of AIDS, Making It, A Woman's Guide to Sex in the Age of AIDS, Inventing AIDS, Last Served, Gendering the HIV Pandemic, and finally, Fatal Advice. She also writes about American popular culture and is currently completing a book about race and acting in post-World War II film. Welcome, Cindy Patton.
I knew he was going to be really funny. And I knew that I was supposed to be the serious person. I first encountered Eve Sedgwick in 1983 over some poetry submitted to a magazine called Bad Attitude, which I once edited. The erotic writing in question was authored by the ID 450 Collective. In those early days, when it seemed that desktop publishing would transform the world of alternative media, I recall being a bit perplexed by the poems. We had promoted our magazine as open to any lesbian erotic writing. And rather than developing a whole new genre for imitation, we hoped to more or less collect work that women had been doing on their own in the absence of a publishing venue. The numbered poems seemed to be just what we were looking for, except we couldn't quite figure out how they were, well, lesbian. Embarrassed at our residual essentialist impulse, we tried to find out who was the author and whether she was, well, a lesbian. What we discovered was that the several authors, and it turned out that I knew a whole bunch of them, were lesbian, straight, bi, and asexual women, collaboratively working out and working through their desires together. I think this collaborative and ambiguous relation to sexuality is in fact characteristic of Eve's approach to the world. Of course, she ranks among the big-name academic stars of our day. And certainly, through some unpleasant exchanges in various media, she became labeled as notoriously straight. But this distance between the superstar straight lady queer and the actual Eve is great. The books are Eve, deeply and fully, but the present Eve, the Eve of the Thanksgiving dinner, the Eve of karaoke, never my favorite hour, the Buddhist Eve, Eve the one-time bodybuilder, or the Eve behind the giant loom, are simultaneously captured in the books, but are still other to them. I will admit that after reading an extended essay or having a major discussion, we have often both needed a nap. As much from the dense complexity of her thinking as from the energetic exchange with her that she encourages, even demands. I'm honored then to introduce Professor Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick, Distinguished Professor of English at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Of course, Professor Sedgwick is already well known to you in the form of her many writings, which span a range of genres and concerns, from poetry to complex formulations and incisive literary analyses to poignant political analysis. Her work is highly regarded in her home discipline of English literature, as well as in philosophy, gender studies, and the emergent field of queer theory. Professor Sedgwick burst onto the literary scene with the publication of her 1985 Between Men. Dead center in the heated feminist debates about the relationship of sex to gender, she reworked and made an important theoretical turn from the writings of anthropologist Gail Rubin. She argued that the apparent competition for women that characterized the novels she studied was actually a highly structured expression of male-male love. This work opened up an entirely new possibility in literary criticism, which had become reinterested in questions of sexuality. But in her trademark fashion, the project was simultaneously literary and political. Her new approach began to queer the text instead of outing the author. Now it seemed any and all texts, not just those by gay authors, could be interrogated about their place in the cultural reproduction of sex-power differences. A flurry of new work appeared from the next generation of literary scholars. And while this was going on, Professor Sedgwick peered deeper into the soul of late modern philosophy. Having displaced sexual orientation as the object of study, she began to explore a range of other queering marks. In her 1990 Epistemology of the Closet, she argued that the trope of opposition in Western philosophy is founded by a notion of interior exterior that finds its most vivid metaphor in the idea of the open secret, the one everyone knows but must not speak, that is, the closet. In addition to inspiring a radical reformulation of literary criticism concerned with gender, the book was also controversial but well received within philosophy. Post-analytic philosophy grandfather Stanley Cavell reviewed the work trenchantly and stated that no one in philosophy can go forward from here without reading Epistemology of the Closet. But this was not her first work. She had already published a major book on the Gothic novel, works that she argued are anxiously and fundamentally about the family, concerned to regulate familial relations, but also to keep the members interior to the family. From the standpoint of her later political writings, we see here the kernel insight that led her to write about preventing the suicide of youth, about cherishing rather than demonizing their particular difference, their queerness. Her essay, How to Bring Your Kids Up Gay, is both an elegant avowal of queerness and a violent critique of the worries straight parents have about their children's sexuality, and also about gay adults' terror of being accused of exerting improper influence on youth. Finally, I want to contextualize another body of her work, and that is Professor Sedgwick's poetry. Professor Sedgwick is, first, in her soul, a poet. But the American Academy is suspicious about and even antagonistic toward poetry. So for many years, poetry took a back seat to the critical and theoretical works. But it must be clear in the care and stylistics of her prose that Professor Sedgwick nonetheless writes as a poet. In a conversation about our writing, she once told me that she is finally unwilling to exact closure on her writing. That is, she rejects the possibility that the essay or the book can be completely transparent to its author. Instead, she invites, even demands of her reader, a reworking of her text. So for many years, we awaited her book, Fat Art, Thin Art. On one hand, a long and brilliantly crafted work of poetry, it is also, quite obviously, theory. After so many years as a closet poet, she was able to show that poetry and theory are not opposite, but that poetry is actually the most appropriate and profound medium of theory. Working through this long poem, I think, allowed her to make a final break on the level of theoretical engagement with gender theory. In a long introduction to a reader on psychologist Sylvan Tompkins' often bizarre theories of affect, Sedgwick is able to reintroduce the question of our bodies' somatic lives in relation not to their selves, but to their physical base. This is still nearly impossible to do without being read as rebiologizing the body. Indeed, a colleague of mine recently expressed grave unhappiness with this essay, which he argued basically says emotion is hardwired, a complete heresy within post-structural theory. But this is not, I think, an adequate reading of the turn to affect in Sedgwick's work. Instead, she reworks the Anglo-American analytic tradition, or rather, one of the most important critics of essentialism within that tradition, J.L. Austin. Eve has reshaped, and I believe offers an entirely different direction for the notion of performativity than that inherited through Derrida and Judith Butler. Sedgwick is still carefully mining this work to reintroduce an opulent physicality of existence. But this new work doesn't look like anything else in gender or queer theory today. It has, rather, taken the unlikely form of theorizing as love letters. And it is from this work that she will read today. It will be a love letter to you, a love letter to us.
Thank you, Cindy. Our third speaker is Michele Wallace. Michele teaches in the English department here at the CUNY Graduate Center, as well as at the City College of CUNY. She's the author of many works of cultural criticism, especially in Black feminist thought, including Invisibility Blues, Black Macho and the Myth of Superwoman, and Black Popular Culture. Welcome, Michele Wallace.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm radically unprepared. It's not as I dreamed it would be, Eve. And so, since I am radically unprepared, one does what one has to do when one's radically underprepared, which is to speak from one's heart, which is not a hard thing for me to do about Eve Sedgwick. And as I was sitting there, let me just tell you why I'm radically unprepared. It's because I defended my dissertation today. Thank you, and I'm very glad to be here today because now it's to be in this building and in this space with all of you. It seems real now. You know how it is. That's what people don't do when you defend what you guys did. In any case, I was thinking as I was sitting here and listening to what Jose had said and what Cindy had said, both wonderful presentations, very different in tone, about what I could say off the cuff. I wouldn't dare try to describe my relationship with Eve as it has progressed thus far. It's been so quixotic and unusual. As I was thinking back about the contacts we've had, and the telephone conversations, one very long conversation about the crying game, and other very special, intimate moments that we've had as people who love certain kinds of ideas. I've had the opportunity to observe closely and benefit from the brilliance of Eve's mind and all those qualities that both, I think Jose was talking about the unofficial Eve, you know, with the quiet voice and the long pauses and all of that, and then the side that Cindy talks about, which is her great intervention in the professionalization of critical theory and literary studies and deconstruction and queer theory and gay and lesbian studies and on, everywhere she goes. Everything she sets her hand to is never the same after she's taken it on. I was thinking about the relationship of this event, but I won't talk to you about my memories because they're still formulating, and maybe one day I'll be able to write something when we're further along in our relationship. One thing is that I'm really, really happy that Eve is here at the Graduate Center. I think in the English department where I am, and it seems to me that this is a very special historical moment to have Eve here now with the kind of, I guess I've never had a chance to say to this audience as well how important I think it is that Clags has developed the way it has at this moment, that queer theory is developing the way it is in English studies. And a lot of things are happening for us right now that could be very important, even in this very sad moment for CUNY in general. This is a moment from which I think we're building strength for the future and in order to survive in the new millennium. But one of the things I was thinking I could tell you anecdotally that was connected to this is that my defense was bumpier than you might think it would be. I had trouble. And when I know that today when I was defending at my defense, that when I got in a real corner, I do what I always do. I pulled out Eve Sedgwick. I have a way of doing that because she's for people who are in, her work is for people who are in enormous need, and I've come to think of her work as being representative of those of us who are interested in using theory, but as poets, not as scientists, but as poets and as artists. Because I think that a poet, that one has to take a creative approach to theory. One also has to integrate theory and scholarship into one's life. Eve is absolutely a role model for me in doing that. I take my role models where I can find them. And when I saw Eve doing that, I said, yes, I can do this. I mean, there's somebody out here who's doing this. She's come to represent for a lot of us, I think, a person who can integrate what's going on with your body, with your life, with your work, with your politics, and not compromise on your art and your theory. Be as intellectual as you want to be as queer as you want to be. And so that's what she's really meant to me. And I was thinking about the way I'm always able, what she does in queer theory, regardless of whether I'm doing Black studies or I'm doing gender or whatever I'm doing in music or in any field, it seems as though I'm always able to find something in the book of Eve Sedgwick. Particularly, my favorite is the Epistemology of the Closet. And I'm getting to know the others that you can use to not transcend the categories, but to leap the categories, to move from category to category, translate things that were never meant to be used in the way that you want to use them to the way you want to use them. So that's what I wanted to say about Eve. And she helped me to get up here today because she said that it makes her uncomfortable for people to talk about her. And I could really relate to that. So I thought it would be good if I just did it this way. Try to jump in the water. This is a great audience. I'm always stunned by the Clags audiences. This is so fantastic to see this here. And I just want to say to Martin and everybody who's involved with Clags, you know, it's just fantastic. So glad to see you. Thank you. Thank you, Eve.
Thank you, Michele. Please join me in honoring and welcoming Eve Sedgwick.
I can't begin to. Thank you. Enough for those. They ask you, like, who would you like to have introduce you? And I just named 3 of my big heroes, and but it's an awkward request because it's like, who do you want to have say nice things about you? So there's a kind of King Lear aspect about it. The talk that I'm giving is taken from a book that I've just finished called A Dialogue on Love, which is a narrative about my therapy. It's just what they always accuse us of when we do anything that has the first person in it. This isn't really scholarship, this is therapy. So I figured, what the hell? And I just went and did it. But I was sort of worrying to my therapist about this event because thrilled as I was also very abashed. And he and I agreed that, you know, we would just draw some boundaries and that it's okay to cry, but I shouldn't wet my pants. So far, that's been, I've succeeded in not transgressing that limit. And I guess I just should explicitly really thank Jill and the board of directors of Clags, and Jose and Cindy and Michele for the incredibly kind introduction and invitation. And also just say how honored I am to be the first person to share the platform with Dr. Michele Wallace. That's a big, big thrill. So as I mentioned, this piece of writing is, the book is a therapy narrative. In some ways, the most interesting thing about the project was the generic problem. There aren't really, it's really hard to know what genre you're writing when you write something like this, because the available genres are like the case history, you know. And then I said to her brilliantly, da 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 da, and then she exhibited her neurosis by once again saying to me, da da da, and that obviously wouldn't work. Or there's the fetchy patient's narrative. You know, not only did he not understand me, but he made me pay him for having sex with him on the couch. And that, in fact, did not describe this therapy. And it was very hard to think what would be a good form for talking about what kind of relationship can actually change things. What does it feel like? How does it come about? What can happen in it? And the closest I could come was the Platonic Dialogue as a model. So that's one of the models that I used, and that's why the book is called A Dialogue on Love. Another model that turns up in the form of this piece is a Japanese form called haibun, that's used in a 17th, 18th century Japanese form that's used in narratives of travel. And that form, which James Merrill used to amazing effect in some of his writing, is just prose interspersed with haiku. So it's a little hard to convey orally. You'll just know when I sort of start reading in a funny voice that there are 17 syllables that are grouped together. Okay, and as I said, this is condensed from a longish book. It's very condensed, don't worry. So there are cuts, but it begins at the beginning. I've spoken on the phone with a therapist who was recommended to me, and we agreed to meet, and all I know about him is he has a kind of nasal Midwestern voice, and his name is Shannon. In the waiting room, do I have a mental image of him at all? The handsome, lean, well-dressed therapists, female and male, in this large practice, filter through the sunny room, greeting their patients, ushering them up or across. I look expectantly at each of the men. And I'm trying now to remember it, the grotesque, reassuring shock of Shannon hovering down a few stairs into this view, mild and bristling with his soft gray nap, big-faced, cherubic, barrel chest, long arms, short legs, Rumpelstiltskin-like, and wearing, I've no doubt, a beautifully ironed, short-sleeved cotton shirt, the color of an after-dinner mint, tucked in at his rotund waist. If it was as hot as Durham usually is in early September, he had a handkerchief, too, for mopping his forehead. There would have been a substantial rumble of genial introduction. My tentative greeting, maybe not quite audible in the middle of it. Was this ordinary for him? The first encounter in this familiar room with big, female, middle-aged bodies, deprecated by the softness of our voices. Maybe in some manual, it's the secret definition of depression. And yet, I told him, settled in his office upstairs, it's not so clear to me that depressed is the right word for what I am. Depressed is what everyone says. I'm weeping in a lot of offices these days, and I'm sure the tears slipped over my lids as I said it. But I think I know depression. I have my own history of it. And it felt 20 years ago when I really was subject to it, so much less bearable than this does, so much. And yet, he says, you're crying now. On record, the triggering event was a breast cancer diagnosis 18 months ago. Shannon doesn't produce an empathetic face at this, or say, that must have been hard for you. He makes an economical nod. I kind of did beautifully with it. I bounced back from the mastectomy, and when it turned out that there was some lymph node involvement too, I tolerated 6 months of chemotherapy without too many side effects. You know, I hated it, and it completely wore me down, but the saving thing for me was that it wasn't all about dread. I know there are people whose deepest dread is to have cancer, to undergo surgery, to deal with the likelihood of dying. I shake my head many times. Those are not my deepest dread. I dread every bad thing that threatens people I love. For me, dread only, I may stop knowing how to like and desire the world around me. That's it, what you mean by real depression? Oh yeah. In some ways, the cancer diagnosis came at the best possible time. The best time if feeling ready to die is a criterion. It was about 2 months after a book of mine had come out. What kind of books do you write, he asks. I tell Shannon I'm a literary critic. I work in gay and lesbian studies. The book was Epistemology of the Closet, and the writing, the organization of it, had come very hard to me for some reason. So I was amazed at how satisfying its publication was. As an object, the book itself looked lovely. Everyone said so. And it did. And for an academic book, it got a lot of attention, a lot of praise. It was one of those happy times when you say to yourself, okay, this is good, this is enough, I'm ready to go now. When the diagnosis came, I was feeling, as an intellectual, loved, used, appreciated. I would have been very, very content to quit while I was ahead. Did it surprise you to be feeling that? No. To feel loved and appreciated, I've slowly grown used to that. And to feel the wish of not living, it's one of the oldest sensations I can remember. But you didn't get your wish. Oh no, breast cancer doesn't usually work like that. I felt sick, but that was from the treatment, not the illness. If the cancer ever does get me, it probably won't be for years. And the chances of that are something like 50-50. Probably there's a smile on Shannon's face after I produce this. Certainly not because he wants me sick, and not either because he's glad I could be well. It's because momentarily he identifies with the mechanical elegance of the trap this disease has constructed for an anxious and ambivalent psyche. 50-50, I think he's thinking. Perfect for turning this particular person inside out. Sometime in these early sessions, Shannon says about why he became a therapist. I've always been fascinated by machines. When I was a kid, I'd take them apart and put them back together just to make sure I knew how they worked. It's still a lot of the reason I like my job. First encounter, my therapist's gift for guyish banalization. I arrive with photos for show and tell, diffidently, but Shannon is game for them. Amazing the mix, I think now, of pride and peevishness behind my choice of these pictures. I was thinking, I guess, of therapy as the place for turning the old twining pains into grown-up, full-throated grievances. But also want Shannon to see in us that same unbroken circle of the handsome, provincial, Jewish family the photos all mean to offer evidence of. We are good-looking. all Mediterranean, all with fine brown frames, and those sparkling or soulful, extravagant lashed eyes of chocolate. All but one dorkily fat, pink, boneless middle child. One of my worst nicknames is Marshmallow. It's true, it's hard to see my mother's eyes. Except in a couple of languid shots from her 20s, she suffers from photo face. The painful, dissociated, clamp-eyed rictus tugging at the cords of her neck to make her look like Nancy Reagan or a tiny Anne Sexton. Another result of this tension is that any child young enough to be held will be transfixed by the flashbulb at some precarious angle to her body, or seem to pop from her arms as toast from a toaster. Shannon wonders at whom her photo face is aimed. I guess at my father, always behind the flash. But really the audience for these photos is the 4 New York grandparents, especially her mother, Nanny, who sews all the dresses and will want to see, or at least will be supposed to want to see, how family-like they make the young family appear. My sister Nina, on the other hand, displays the googly eyes in their platonically ideal form, and at this moment of Western culture, that makes her look like Annette Funicello. Uncanny how frontal, as toddler and child, she always manages to be, whether in the mode of cute or seductive. There's something perfect about her, something that gives a snap to snapshots. It's also clear she loves her baby sister, if awkwardly. Eyes glued to the camera, she holds on as if for life to my waist or leg, me apparently struggling to withdraw from the picture, from her attentions. In the pictures from back then, I'm never quite there. It's as though I might will my whole being into my fingertips, and from them into something else through touch, a stuffed panda, my other hand, a book or cat, the fabric of a skirt. I haven't brought teenage pictures, until one stylized shot where I'm 19, eyes crinkled with laughter and embarrassment, as Hal, who's 23, is pushing a morsel of our wedding cake into my mouth. Empathetically, urgingly, his mouth gapes toward mine like a mother bird's. Is there any way this Hal can be as sweet as he looks? Yeah, and then some. As seen a few years later in the small circle of unspeakably tender, slightly sad protection he creates for me in a visit to my parents' house. Those are years of acute depression for me, the years that convince me I can't bear to bring my mind close again to this Kosofsky world. Recent pictures, professional ones this time, are from my folks' 50th anniversary. Mother sends Daddy her brutal photo face. Her real face, which turns out to be inquisitive, mischievous, and longing, gravitates helplessly, though she isn't trying to help it, toward the unmade-up, white-framed, down-to-earth visage of W, the new, cherished intimate. A slightly older, you okay? A slightly older German-Jewish photographer and professional woman, whose gravely literal aura and round eyes are not so unlike my dad's. My own eyes, blue with the electric blue of my shirt, are also magnetized, blotting up as if passively, one by one, each of the three. Yes, we always used to joke at home about my mom being a dyke. What do you mean, joke? For that matter, what do you mean, always? Well, as long as I can remember, at least from my teens, it was this family joke. Not that it was treated as something that could really happen, but as a true fact about how my mother was, what interested her, sure. Like what? How would it sound? You sound as if you haven't heard this particular family joke before. No, I haven't, though I might like to. I get the feeling it's very Kosofsky. Yeah, that's true. It's one of those things that make a girl proud to be Kosofsky. Were they mean jokes? Would she make them herself? I don't think they were mean at all. Like, she would come back from swimming at the Y, and there'd be a lot of joking about her hanging around the locker room to ogle naked women. And she would say it too? Oh yeah, of course, it was her own account. Or she would joke about crushes she used to have on her teachers or on women athletes when she was a kid. I think I heard a lot more about Babe Didrikson than most English teachers' daughters do. Was there ever serious talk or just these jokes? Only the jokes. I promise you that was how we dealt with everything sexual, at least until she was almost 70 and met W. Tell me some more of them. Oh, it's hard for me to remember. There was a standing routine about how she always wanted her hair shorter, how she could never get her haircutters to believe how short she really wanted it. Then as soon as my father or someone would say her hair looked nice, she'd say it was time for a new haircut. But in these pictures, she doesn't look mannish, does she? No, she's dainty, dainty. The best thing, I'm telling Shannon one day, I think the thing I'd most want somebody to know about how I've lived. Oh, I do seem to be confessing to you that I have the secret vice of mentally writing my obituary. Do you think you can bear it? Shannon Mime's invitation. What I'm proudest of, I guess, is having a life where work and love are impossible to tell apart. Most of my academic work is about gay men, so it might seem strange to you that I would say that. Not being a man, not even, I don't think, being gay, but it's still true. The work is about sex and love and desire to begin with, so it's almost bound to be involving at that intimate level. But even beyond that, oh, where to start? Well, I should say that one true thing about me is that my love is with gay men. I don't quite understand what the term fag-hag means. Anyway, I don't understand what it could mean nowadays. Fag-hag conjures up for me a scene at a bar in the 1950s where a lot of self-hating people are getting very drunk. Me, I don't even drink. Anyway, sometimes I think the term fag-hag has a fake specificity. Maybe it does the same work that, say, Nigger Lover did in the 50s and 60s, to punish anyone who just doesn't feel some form of contempt that their society says they ought to feel. So I don't have any sense whether or not the term describes me. And of course, it isn't that I like or love all gay men. Naturally, I don't. I love the particular people I do love. Still, all these aspects of my life are so intimately involved with each other. A funny fate for someone who's so shy. As though if you don't have the talent to fake intimacy a lot of the time, you're forced to do the real thing. This is from Shannon's notes. They're going to be Shannon's notes are going to be interspersed through here. Shannon writes, I asked her to talk some about how being in her family was for the various members. We talked mostly about her father. He appears to have been constantly involved with gathering information for no obvious end. He has continued to take a course a semester to this day in almost any and every subject area. E was very afraid of him, but is not sure why, other than remembering how he would get angry, puffing up and turning red, as if about to explode, but not physically violent. I have a hard time getting a cohesive picture of him, one which doesn't feel fragmented to me. I'm not sure how to view this difficulty I'm having. Father seems vital and alive, not especially depressed or disappointed, but somewhat alien to E. Possibly his inner life just is very fragmented, or otherwise somehow ingenuous. E's brother experienced him as kind, gentle giant, and appreciated all the knowledge. But there is the fact that E has considerable math difficulty, which she traces back to his trying to teach her math concepts. Also associates her poor memory, allergy to information, with his being Mr. Information. I, on the other hand, experience her as plenty curious, well-informed. Question mark, question mark. Shannon writes, sense of mother as wishful, inventive, vis-a-vis reality. Did I tell you about my mother explaining what to do if you got lost in a store? Told me to ask someone to take me to the lost and found and wait there for her. I visualized a mezzanine with a number of children sipping sodas and waiting. Later, I got lost in a department store, couldn't find mother, went to a salesperson and asked to be taken to Lost and Found. They couldn't figure out what I meant, explained that Lost and Found was a drawer with left behind glasses and gloves in it. Frightened and in the wrong. Another time, E was left to take bus home without much money. That's okay, the buses have a special fare for children. Not so. Mom's pleasure, pride in inventiveness and not being literal-minded. vis-a-vis father as pedantic, literal-minded. Years ago, my little brother sent me a great analysis of certain pivotal moments in both our adult lives, moments he labeled acknowledging the reality of like poverty, weather, death or pain or systemic injustice, or that certain processes take actual time. All the things we learned to be so proud of magicking away as kids, waving the Rita-conferred wand of ambiguity, imagination. Not for us, those plodding dualisms, the ones less agile people got stuck in like dinosaurs in the tar pits. No original sin. None of the immemorial quarrels into which people are drafted long before their birth. For sure, it gives a freshness to our adult encounters, the freshness of slow learners. Vocabulary list, nuance, ambivalence, gamine, wistful, brisk. Shannon writes, talks about the feeling of being responsible for me, for my involvement, for drawing out my best interest and intelligence to interact with her, likens it to trying to engage her mother, who would interact with her as a person, as if adult for a time, and then arbitrarily cut that off and treat her like a child, but in an inauthentic way. Nursery school teacher's voice, sing-song, over-enunciated saccharine. Some estranging sense, radiating discomfort of mother with child. Hating that. My first memory of real hatred. A blade, a glass wall. I'm wondering if you were a holy terror, Shannon says one day. In certain ways, you sound like what parents would perceive as quite a difficult kid. But also some you sound malleable and passive. Do you have a sense of whether you seem to your folks like a good child? Oh, I hope so. I'm fervent. That was absolutely all I wanted to be. It was? Oh, yeah. Is that queer? I literally can't remember a single time I deliberately made mischief. It's funny, I know I must have been a smart, creative kid. It must have been in my nature somewhere to be active, aggressive, even sadistic. The only actual motives I remember having, though, were almost abject. I'd have done anything on earth to win my parents' love and admiration, and to keep far away from trouble. Oh, and I guess to keep everyone away from trouble, as if middle child were like an identity, or the lack of one. Since it seemed the very essence of middle childness to identify with everyone but myself. I remember in 4th grade reporting in show and tell on my sister's arithmetic homework. Oh, that syndrome, Shannon says. I do think I know that one. And he narrates a Twilight Zone plot to illustrate. But no, I never saw it. I'm thinking of a girl text, Little Women. This Shannon hasn't read, where the sister I yearned toward was not Jo, the bookish Butch, nor pretty artistic Amy, nor, well, did anyone ever identify with Meg, but rather slow, musical Beth, called by her father Little Tranquility, whose death in late girlhood sets a seal of peace on her stormy family. Birds in their little nests agrees her favorite song. Even back then, I wondered, reading, whether she was mentally retarded or just stimulus averse like me. But oh, the quiet around such deathbeds. How low the price of love, just that one sister so willing disappear. A moment's realization, startlingly clear. I've figured out what it means when I complain to you about things, I tell him, or to anybody. When I tell you how bad it is, how hard I've worked at something, how much I've been through, there's only one phrase I want to hear, which is, that's enough. You can stop now. Stop living, that is, and enough hurting. Like, I didn't realize how hard it was for you. You've done well. You've been through plenty. You're excused. That's enough. You can stop now. Isn't this the blessing into whose enfolding arms every complaint of suffering bounds in its dreams? At least it means that in my native land. 5 miles across the border, phrase books say, it's different. There, it's a way that parents calm their kids. Shannon writes, from a while ago, E has latched onto the concept that she is someone who feels need to make others smarter. This coming from recognition that she felt responsible for eliciting my intelligent interest. She has asked several people about this and got confirmation, except from one friend whom she clearly feels she has made smarter. Is really shaken up by this, but still holds on to the concept of herself as making people smarter. Eve, make them smart equals spank them? Relates back to the early engagement problems with her mother. But from the deflation brought about by her friend's disconfirmation, she focuses on the grandiosity in the concept. My comment is that normal development seems to me to move from grandiosity to disillusionment, but in her case it maybe moves to her trying to consolidate and make practical her somewhat grandiose way of seeing herself. When Shannon pushes the story toward adolescence, I love evoking Girl Scout camp, age 12, getting a crush on one of my counselors, cutting my thumb with a knife while whittling soap, and being deliciously fussed over and comforted, being inept at all the camp-type activities, but still feeling as if I was making a place for myself with sheer dorky eviness. Unexpectedly and unpreparedly getting my period in the middle of all this, very embarrassed, but again, fussed over, enjoying that. Intimacy, trading stories about grown-up things, death, sex, with a baby Butch in my tent, early experiments with the pleasure of voices, mine silvery then, in the dark. I can contrast this lusciously homosocial space with the strained, puppet-like heterosexual impositions and self-impositions of junior high school. Shannon remarks, but it doesn't really sound as if there was anything sexual about this Girl Scout camp space. It doesn't? I mean, it wasn't co-ed or anything, not like your school. Unmistakable manifestations of impatience from the sofa. What you're describing about the camp, he says, it sounds like that has to do with nurturance, really, not with sexuality. Like these have nothing to do with each other? Well, sure, but you need to make it clearer then what kind of sexual charge some of this might have had, what it felt like to you. It felt like, a good image for it is, I mean, you wouldn't know about this, but imagine what it feels like when you're about to get your period. There's an almost familiar tug, a hand closing in your abdomen. You don't particularly associate it with your cycle, at least if you're really young. It feels more like your own self-presence, but more so. Later, of course, it turns into ordinary pain, but before being cramps, it's this pull as if of excess gravity that you could read as sexual, but you could also not. That's the best image I have for being at camp. Whereas what was going on at school, it was, at least for me, it was more like trying to learn a language. And except for English, I'm awful at languages. I find only half a dozen teenage snapshots to show, and mostly they don't show much. Shannon's words for this body and face are matronly, mask-like, and I guess I can see why. But one he connects with, showing me under a tree with my father's dad, whom I look just like, and inimitably out of it. It occurs to me to say, something I see in that picture we haven't talked about and might sometime. That's the notion of sweet. I think sweet is probably pretty important. Shannon taking off his thick glasses, staring closely at the snapshot, then to my surprise, springing nimbly from the chair. I'm kind of knock-kneed, so I'm not sure I can do this, but he says, and I see he's studying the picture and trying to pretzel into just the same posture. Feet in a sort of third position, chin and eyes down and to the right, hands clasped in a twist behind his back. Having done so, sweet, he announces, Sweet, you're right. It feels sweet. I had no idea, just looking at it, quite how sweet it was. But I can feel it in the tension across my shoulders, all the way down into my back, kind of smiling, looking off to the right. Yes, sweet is what I feel. Shannon, bewitching. Shannon writes, returns to above in that she talks a lot about seventh grade and the dismissal of her French teacher after being arrested for soliciting in a men's room. This involves a lot of thematic material. I still can't figure out what Shannon means by the word thematic. This involves a lot of thematic material. She had not known that, as her mother explained it, there were men who loved other men the way most men love women. This caught her imagination, and she began reading insatiably in the area, but only about gay men. It was only later that she learned about lesbians. This intensity was some propelled by her chagrin at having misread the French teacher so completely, her perceptual acumen having failed her. Yet, in the looking into and learning about it, her fascination with implicit themes was engaged and sharpened. It also provided something of an out in her struggle with the heterosexual demands of adolescence, that there could be something other than the traditional hetero relations, and men who might have an interest in women, other than the traditional one. What strikes me most here is early ability to turn a situation of prohibition and rigid either-or into a new interest that is elastic, productive, exciting for Eve's view of world, but how to relate to her junior high school depression. Shannon writes, continues on the theme of the anxiety attendant on her in the family space. Memories of being teased, ridiculed, about not being able to take a joke, being thin-skinned, etc. She often did not feel part of or believe she was part of the family, and so was open to attack from various members. She actually was different in skin from all of the others in the family, and so when they went to the beach summers, she both was the object of a lot of greasing and creaming and concern, and also always burned. The tactile sense of pain and the unhappiness and alienness are vivid in her memory. Now, when she goes to the beach, she stays in during the day and enjoys the evening walks. Unclear why her parents did not structure things to accommodate her difference. But then, when we've gotten up to go after the session and we're confirming our times for the next week or two, suddenly I notice Shannon suspended motionless, gazing dumbly at his appointment book. I wait patient for about half a minute, then, yes, I quiz him. He looks up with a strange smile. Well, he says, I seem to have somebody else's name written down for your time next Friday. And it isn't that I got mixed up and made an appointment with somebody else either. I knew it was with you. I just wrote down somebody else's name instead. There's a long, odd silence. I feel vastly amused, I guess, at the psychoanalytic stylization of this moment. Also funnily touched. Also, I suppose, ready to feel insulted, who's been eating my porridge, though not actually feeling so. Want to say something like, well, sweetheart, you're the shrink. You're supposed to tell me what all this means. But Shannon remains very taken aback. For him, it's too early to laugh. I see there's something disproportionate going on, but I have no way of knowing whether it's all about me, his feelings for me, or none, or just a little. Is this a joke I'm in on that I make the pith of, or is there some other intimacy on his docket so vastly stronger or sweeter than ours that even to associate the two makes a joke? It feels unexpectedly Hamish and familiar, this included-excluded relation to Shannon's inner process. I'm also noting the discussion of slips of this kind has formed no part of our discourse. I'd looked forward to it in advance, but I've only had reason to feel how resistant he always seems to focusing on the level of the signifier. Yet this mistake really captures him, captures and throws him. Finally, I can gather my wits a little and say, I hope affectionately and lightly, but I'm not sure. I guess if you really want to see someone else during that hour, it could be arranged. To which he responds with, again, disproportionate amusement or something. Still with the appointment book open at his waist, he swings back on his heels in a 360-degree revolution of inarticulacy, to wind up facing me again, laughing heartily, and we say a cheerful goodbye. Ah, little man. We stumble back to a notation that really struck me as right. Namely, I envision my bond with my mother as a therapy relationship in which I am the therapist. Probably I've always related to her in this way. That is, I've had an immemorial motive of eliciting, supporting, helping her inhabit and extend a certain true self, rather than a more available false self, that nursery school mother. Shannon likes the idea, but he wants me to feel, too, the important difference from real therapy, that this therapist needed and yearned for exposure to that true self of the patient's. Maybe all that made it true was that it was what I needed. It comes to me, too, that even though it was my own childish needs that drove the therapy, our practice must also have required me, or else permitted me, to learn a rather imposing habit of silence about my own needs. Hasn't that been the major defense I've mounted against my mother all those years? Defense of, and also against her. I'm saying to him one day, apparently I see myself as quite a timid person, though also, I guess, brave in a different register. But sometimes I think you see me as timid in ways I don't even have a clue about. And he nods seriously. But he adds, I don't think timidity is just a trait that lives inside a person, but instead something relational. There are lots of things that are perfectly easy if you're doing them with someone else, but almost impossible if you feel you're doing them alone. Which is just plain true. Like going to a party where no one knows you, excruciating by yourself, effortless when a friend will come too. And at once it's vivid to me again, the bliss of moving within a beloved aegis. It feels more than protective, it feels electrifying. The pride in childhood of going anywhere with my older sister. The extravagant rightness of it, intimate sanctioned for us to be sealed with my favorite pronoun, the dear first person plural. It never surprised me that we in French means yes. Even in adulthood, I'm addicted to the word. Oh yes, we saw that movie. Our favorite restaurant. We figured out how Michael, my family, students, friends find it puzzling. We saw that? Not that I remember. Secretly, this is a matter of pride to me. Promiscuous, we. Me plus anybody else. Permeable, we. I want to know from Shannon, don't you ever find yourself suspicious when I'm so sanguine about all these intimate relationships of mine? Hal, Michael, friends, students. Don't you wonder, can that much good relating really happen? And where are all the conflicts? With some thought, he says, for a long time I was aware of staying agnostic about it. Not suspicious, but close to that. But over time, I guess I figured that if you've been systematically misperceiving all these relationships, well, it is systematic. It seems to work in a consistent way for you. But also, over time, I can see from our interactions how you are good at intimacy. And terrible at conflict, I add, since this is right after he and I have had some cataclysmic fights. Well, yeah. But then I can picture these relationships better, and they make sense enough. Are you asking this because you want to flash me a yellow light? No, I don't think so, but I sometimes wonder whether you think I over-idealize my friends, kind of wholesale. You think, he says? I think about it, sure. Last week, Mary described me to myself as scattering sequins over us all the people I love. She's right. She and they do seem so glamorous and numinous to me. I always see the light shaking out of their wings. It does shock me when anyone views them in an ordinary light, or worse, when they see each other that way. Shannon says, you don't seem so given to disenchantment. Only with you, I have to answer him, laughing. I seem to play that game over and over with you, my Barbie doll to dress and undress. Otherwise, really no, except for very early in relationships. It's as though I want to start out powdering people with fairy dust when I first know them. Like there's a working hypothesis that I'll trust them, we're playing the same exciting game, that they're radiant, kind, mysteriously talented, spiritually powerful. With lots of people, the sequence naturally drop off soon, quite without melodrama or really embitterment. But if people stay numinous to me for a while, then there they are in the pantheon. I guess it's very silly. At least it's transparently narcissistic. Catering to my amour propre is a sure path to Godhead. And threatening it. Shannon says, yes, he does see me very given to such idealizations. There's a long silence. Often it's sobering to be agreed with. I pick up with the idealizing habit, how it's related to being so depressive. Asking Shannon, do you think it's just defending me against a fearful certainty that if I ever took off my emerald glasses or stopped hurling sequins, the world around me would be exposed as black and white instead of color, or awful, or just plain dead? Meaning, is all this Bob Mackie glamour holding onto one big lie? I see that sometimes that's exactly the feeling, Shannon says. I've known other people besides you who do this too. But actually, it seems like a pretty wonderful adaptation. It makes them happier, and it makes the people around them different and better. It improves the environment. You mean it's nice, I say to him, making fun of his bland way of speaking. Well, yeah. Not just nice, but can you keep it in your head how very nice it is, and also that it is a kind of depressive idealization at the same time? You mean without ontologically ranking the two views of it? Because it's the pressure to rank them that's really depressive, isn't it? Shannon writes, at the end of the hour, she sketches a dream. She is 10 minutes late for an appointment with me and arrives at my house where everything is in disarray. I am there, a number of kids who keep popping up, people coming and going, my wife. E is included in what is going on, but is not able to get my full attention, although her feeling is also one of intimacy and pleasure. There is a child who is being cared for by a seemingly retarded woman reading to him. Kid's name is David. E was late because she had trouble getting dressed, and her clothes are on her body in something of a stuck-on manner. She has brought a chiffon pie and notices that her bra has gotten baked into a layer of the pie. She pulls it out, saying that some scarf has gotten in here, trying to conceal that it is her bra. I go off into a bathroom. She finds herself under a lap robe with another person and my wife, arms around each other's shoulders. She asks about the kids, and my wife says David is our shadow child, an experiment that failed. She reflects on having come to see me, but ending up close with my wife. Shannon writes, dream. Meat counter and pile of tiny colored, dead, adorable elephants. Without magical thinking, I imagine the world would be gray, no colors, air pushed out of it, like a pile of dead little elephants. The horror was in how cute they still were. At first, I thought I'd know when therapy was successful, because I'd stopped feeling the want of being dead. But I finally say to Shannon, this is such a deep, old fact about me that it could be a terrible index of what might change if I waited for that. I'm wondering now what else might be different and better, even for someone who remains convinced with the ancients that it would be best not to be born. Yes, Shannon says, he too has assumed that this is a likely scenario, many other things changing, but the one thing not changing. Also, he says, if such a thing did change, it would probably do so imperceptibly slowly. Then he produces an apparent non sequitur. A story about a patient of his long ago, someone with not exactly multiple personalities, but I would say that the parts of her were only barely holding hands, who, after many years, in fact, long after the end of therapy, woke up one morning and found she no longer had multiples, just that suddenly. Looking back, I think he's produced this story just in case. Just in case, that is, what my announcement really meant was something different. Something like, I think I'm ready to relinquish this stubborn symptom, but I'm scared about what will be left of me. I love his floating the story so coolly as a non sequitur, a story about the non-necessity in therapy of what follows. It gives me a clue. I want to be open to the chance that what any clamorous pain wants to tell me is that it is ready at last to bid me goodbye. After this, in fact, I get very charmed and relaxed by everything that looks like non-necessity. I've started noticing how lots of Shannon's best comments, the ones that change the aspect of things for me, amount to nothing more or less profound than it ain't necessarily so. Nowadays, when students ask me about one thing or other, but wouldn't that clearly imply, or doesn't that have to involve, it feels Shannon-like when I can respond, that may not be a theoretical question, just empirical. Okay, my parents are coming to visit me, and as a result of a fantasy I have, Shannon sets up an hour to meet with my mother and an hour to meet with my father, followed by an hour of meeting with me to suck the juice out of it. Shannon writes, 3 hours today, E's mother, then her father, then E late in the day. The style of the parents is quite different. Rita is always moving. You are never sure if you will get a real answer or a canned one or an evasion. I've never met anyone who moves around so much, he tells me, not physically, but in terms of where she is in the conversation. It made me think of the old Starship Enterprise. Yes, I think we're getting a radar fix. No, it's gone. No, I think we're getting closer. Sorry, sir, it's drifting. Yes, here it is. Shannon writes, she communicates the promise of something interesting and real and somehow edifying, but does not reliably deliver. She is quite bright, erudite, and creative. The father is much warmer and kinder, but without the bright incisiveness of his wife. His talk is elusive and fragmented, dense and somehow melancholy. He also dwells on the later years, even when I try to get him to talk about the early years. Rita, in contrast, stays with the preteen years. She presents a picture of a child who sprang into being fully formed. She realized early that E was brilliant and, denying any intimidation by or trouble with her brilliance, says she was not afraid of E as long as she was bigger than E. Then says that didn't last long. Shannon says the sense of this kid being uncanny or a changeling was stronger than he could have pictured. He mentions several stories they both told going way back to toddlerhood that somehow all led to the same punchline. And from then on, we realized she was going to go her own way. Somehow, as if any display at all of my agency was the same as a full-scale declaration of independence, as if the day I quit nursery school was the day I left for college. From what you say, I almost wonder if they perceived me as a child at all, whether they had any ordinary enjoyment of me as a kid or attention to me as one, or worries about me that weren't organized around the supposed strangeness of this presence. I tried and tried to elicit stories like that, he says. They just wouldn't come up with any. Was she cute? Did you have fun with her? Did she have trouble teething? No. A long pause. Shannon writes, throughout this interview, Rita casts things in terms of aren't all families, or most children are. Yet she is clearly very invested in this girl. Another trait is her use of not something one would ask or talk about or mention in a number of contexts. She always wondered why Eve and Hal didn't have children, but would never ask. Especially in the area of sexuality, she says that they were not restrictive. We never covered the children's nakedness, but not prone to talk about it. But then she says that her students have commented to her on the amount of sexual allusion in her teaching. It seems to run in the family. Then says that all children are sexually aware and feeling early. She was aware of E's sexuality, but of course would never have mentioned it. The father is in awe of E rather than being afraid of her. I talk with E, telling her all this for almost the whole hour. She is quite pleased and relieved that I saw the things that she has been telling me she experienced. After the hour, I feel some down. As best I formulated, it is that, well, yes, it really was like I thought it was, and so now what? No secrets to uncover, nothing to find out to make it different. We'll see if E has any of this reaction. That night, my folks have a chance to compare notes about their conversations with Shannon. My father remarks on a phrase they both found themselves using, something like, Eve always knew what she knew, and knew she knew it, whether she was right. But over the weekend, I get a chance to ask my mother, can you bear another psychohistory question? Would you tell me some about what it was like for you to have Nanny as a mother? I see her scanning the angles of this question. What particular damning judgments of herself mightn't it entail? Finally, generously, she doesn't second-guess it. Pretty good, I'd say. Certainly she tried hard. Pretty good considering. How's that? Well, my mother says, of course, different people would give you different answers about any parent. For me, the hardest thing about Nanny was her loud voice. You know, that's not something it's easy for me to deal with, and I've developed a very different manner from that myself. That was painful to me. Also, Nanny was very certain in her judgments. She always knew she was right. She had a hasty temper, and she would let you feel her anger. Though, Daddy adds, she never held a grudge. No, that's very true. When her anger was over, it was over. She was an intensely intelligent woman, my mother is going on, intensely, and she accomplished an amazing amount considering her lack of education. If she'd been educated, she's somebody who would have made a mark in the world. I pipe up. It's always been hard for me to imagine Nanny as the mother of babies. I remember when I was little, she used to terrify me, always threatening to gobble me up because I looked so delicious. As if irony and aggression were her only modes of affection. You have such rough skin, such disgustingly rough skin. Rrr. It was years before I could decide whether she actually meant these things. I remember explicitly telling myself she couldn't mean them because everyone else said I had really soft skin. And even then I found it alarming. Her voice was so raucous, her movements were so startling and abrupt. But was she like that with you too? Yes, my mother says she was. There's a pair of us. She, refined to her, quiet by the long labor of refusing her mother's noisy and pointed wit of the fishwife and her own relish in it. I, the refusal of a refusal. Refusals everywhere, these corrosive ones. Also, though, my mother could have felt early on, somehow, that this odd child's presence embodied her own mother, someone she'd find at unpredictable moments really alarming. The both of us so quick to be certain that we knew what we did know. The dangerous thing about being mistaken by my mother for her own apparently all-powerful mother was that she would fantasy me too to be competent, powerful, invulnerable. Me sobbing and sobbing, but saying, okay, my mouth wants to say she couldn't believe that. Being a child, I needed care and attention, but the simple truth is that I still identify with her enough not really to believe it myself. On a day soon thereafter, I've had in mind the conventional terms of the family romance, where they think I'm just their kid, but I know that I'm really the exiled daughter of the king and queen of Mars. But this is just the opposite, isn't it? Where they are convinced that, for better or worse, I come from some other planet. And it's I who don't know. I who think to be their own peasant child, to be one of them. In fact, who longs to be so. Shannon makes it sound as if they were apt to treat me as a kind of independent contractor living in the house. Or ambassador of a neighboring principality, maybe. Do you think that's why their discipline always felt so cataclysmically raw to me, I suddenly think to ask. It's not that it was frequent or especially brutal, but it's children who get spanked, not ambassadors. If I was used to all that inexplicable protocol, then it must have felt like the strangest assault on my dignity. Almost my national dignity, mustn't it? The next morning, just waking, massive as having a stroke, come two realizations. But, I tell Shannon, like Jeopardy, the trick here is in the question. Here's the question. How to relate young Eve's family situation on the one hand to her personal, professional, political, academic engagements over the past 15 years, and specifically her relation to queer stuff on the other. Yeah, I'm listening. Okay, in each case, imagine somebody who expends extortionate amounts of energy trying to convince the members of some group, not a particularly privileged group, not a high-status group, in fact, a clannish, defensive, stigmatized, but proud, and above all, an interesting group, that she, too, is to be accepted as, and in fact truly is, a member of this group, a kid, a Kosofsky, or later, gay. But each time it's in the face of some inherent, in fact, obvious absurdity about the claim. But Shannon sensibly asks her, why would she want to do that? Well, of course, as a kid, because I have no choice about it. But then as an adult, because what? Because it feels right. It feels productive and true, too. Oh, and of course, by then, because it's what I'm used to doing. Only visibly more preposterous this time. Now that I almost know what it is that I'm claiming or offering, it's like a big dare. Also like a big allegory about love, experimental, and, at least to me, metamorphic, which is how I recognize love. It's as if I can now understand the ineffable happiness and the fragility and depletion attaching to it, too, that goes for me with being accepted and loved in my personal life, I mean, as an essential central member of a queer family, whose ideology, yes, I do a lot of work in articulating, making new, trying to make compelling to others. In this small but not quite circumscribable context, yes, I can recognize others and be recognized in many aspects that don't this time around seem to denegate one another, as loving and bright, as included and constitutive and not too scary. While in a bigger gay lesbian scene, what I've maybe helped happen, both for me and for the self-perception and group perception of some other people, is so much more partial, iffy, streaky, potentially upsetting, often thrilling, feels completely risky. But it's a recognizable transformation of the same project, trying to convince this family that I'm not the daughter of the King and Queen of Mars. Next thing I see, it makes so much sense how this adult project of queer community resonates with my old need to be my mother's therapist, to promote her turning into somebody less anxious and fuller. Yeah, I know, big duh, right? Well, Shannon says consideringly, yes. Especially, I mean, to the extent that her potential for being different and happier was visibly tied up with a lesbian possibility. Because that lesbian component went in two directions whose double vectoring now feels so familiar and, in a bizarre way, so comfortable to me, first, as having something obscurely to do with who I was, woman myself, but at the same time, how much of what she suffered was a deeply lodged protest against a life immobilized in this nuclear scene of caring for children. So the girl child who somewhere in the future makes part of the scene still has to non-exist if the beloved is to materialize. Melodrama of uncertain agency called Bringing Out Mama. Shannon writes, free-floating creativity lately. Suddenly lots of arts and crafts fascination. It's strange because I'm excited about writing, at least the one project, this one, that I've now started on. But this arts and crafts stuff thrills me. I don't think I've quite had this feeling before because it is so not writing. Writing, my perfectionism gets all over everything. I wrestle and contort to keep it at bay long enough for words to get onto the screen. Like Michelangelo, knowing what's supposed to emerge from the marble block, my task is to excise everything that isn't that. Maybe it's called knowing what you're doing. It feels less and less good. But in this other indiscriminate realm, that conscience has no foothold. What am I doing? Messing with stuff. Having materials in my hands, seeing at an instant of pause and speculation whether there's something satisfying, something surprising to me that they almost are. little to ask. When they turn into anything lovely, I'm in joy. It's hard for me to admit to Shannon around this time a habit I have on gray days or early evenings when I'm sad or ragged of driving past the corner of 9th and Main Streets, casting my eyes for solace up 4 stories to the lit-up, honeyed cell of his availability to someone, if not me. Shannon writes, dream with Hal and me and my mother. Hal and I having sex in a big old hotel, enjoying, but I have to find my mother, looking for her. Realize that I forgot to notice whether either of us had an orgasm. Disconcerting. Hotel under renovation, and there are exposed floors, whole sides open with no walls. Cannot get to the dining room that my mother is in from where I am. Originally 2 different buildings with different foundations. Then there turns out to be a way if you go around and through a back entrance. The dream leaves E delighted with this portrayal of her sexuality at this time. The exposed structure, incoherence of levels, the confusion of Hal and her mother. Question of orgasm just floating out there. Shannon writes, haiku and crafts, yes. It does seem like quite a strangeness. The floating downstream with a current that's so resolutely wordless. As though in all its modesty, its refusal to generate propositions, selves, ideas. This crafts thing might be a cataclysmic change disguised as an unassuming indulgence, as though if I let my habitual yes stretch this far, there could never be another no. Shannon writes, neck pain, tearful, feeling bad, will contact MD today. Shannon writes, silk work, turning fabric into other fabric, childhood blanket with a satin binding, skin hunger, the fascination everyone had with how silky my skin was. May say something about how hungry our skin was for touch. The downside of being silky was that somehow I was an object for others to satisfy their touch needs, not mine. Treasure scraps of silk. Somehow the silk and shit go together. The waste products, fantasies of self-sufficiency, not dependent, spinning straw into gold. Shannon writes, good work on an attractive woven scarf, the product of the weekend's learning how to work with a table loom. Tactile, nonverbal, regressive, enjoyable. Lacking the constant alertness in her writing about being or becoming the right person to do it. Twice E is in the middle of parsing the threads of influences and meanings of some part of this or some topic, and the thread of the reasoning gets lost. Not sure what this is, more than just being preoccupied with weaving. Shannon writes, resistance to going back to the dialogue on love is that production of the first person is both labor-intensive and felt to be constraining, that there were emotional registers that weren't available while generating first person. A texture book wouldn't need to have a first person at all, any more than weaving itself does. That rhymes with a lot of stuff for me, the Buddhist stuff, mania for making unspeaking objects, the childhood experience of traveling in the car with the family in the dark. The cars, each of us, bubbles of the same dark, strung in a dark necklace. I can't remember if it's Stephen or Michael who first shows me Sogyal Rinpoche's Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. Of course, I head straight for the chapters on how to die, which feel awfully alien. But as I start to read from the beginning, something else happens. One assumption I realize with surprise I've seen before in Proust, that when the truth comes to you, you recognize it because it makes you happy. Shannon writes, had scan of neck Friday to rule out anything more than muscle strain as cause of the neck pain. Turns up a spinal metastasis of the breast cancer of almost 6 years ago. I ask what it means. She says it means she will die of this, not necessarily soon though, as cancer seems an indolent one, and so far only in E's bones. 2 years, 5 years, some live a decade or more. Reaction so far is a little relief of the other shoe variety, and just dealing with the huge logistics of more workups, neck brace, plans for radiation, what to do about the semester's teaching, etc. In some sense, this is still a reaction to the diagnosis, with her reaction as it relates to her life still to register. Phones just outside the clinic door. Impermanence arrives so quickly. Shannon writes, dream. Medical checkup in building made over from Romanesque cathedral. E arrives with Hal, then is with 2 nurses, and notices she is separated from Hal, concerned that he will be worried and unable to find them. Exam by her oncologist and an older MD. Her oncologist has cancer now, and the older MD has had it, has shirt off and scars on his torso. Moving around in the building, Eve catches a glimpse of a high, round-arched attic room somewhere. Someone has just left, empty now, but full of golden yellow light for reading, and feels a longing to be there. A result of Tess is benign, though, and she is sorrowful with some of the do I belong in this family feeling. I tell Shannon, like he couldn't guess, that Buddhism's conscious love of rest, death, non-being are more congenial to me than the Western heroic thrust for individuation and survival, which seems plain phony to me. I like the explanation Robert Thurman gives in his introduction to the Tibetan Book of the Dead. When we see this equation, he writes, the Enlightenment equation between death and oblivion, we can understand at once why materialists scoff at spiritual or religious forms of liberation. Why would they need it? They have already guaranteed themselves permanent rest. They have a guaranteed nothingness waiting for them, obtained without the slightest effort on their part, without ethical sacrifice, without realization, without developing any skill or knowledge. All they have to do is fall asleep, a skill they have already cultivated during thousands of nights. But what is it, he goes on, that provides them the guarantee of a restful nothing awaiting them after death? The answer is obviously that they have no grounds at all for this belief. It is merely a belief based on brave assertion, corroborated by many other believers, all without a shred of evidence, reinforced by constant repetition and dogmatic insistence. It provides ultimate comfort, satisfying their religious urge to have a complete sense of reality. This comfortingness might give rise to suspicion or doubt. So is disguised for the materialist by the pretense that nothingness is something frightening, something undesirable, a bitter pill that he or she, the brave modern human grown-up, has learned to swallow, unquote. Shannon writes, dream with her in session, and my saying, instead of talking, I would play the piano, a piece written for the crown and being sent to the unrebellious dissidents in the North. She finds the piece relaxing, and the concept of music being sent to the unrebellious dissidents to enfold them into the sphere of the crown fascinating. Humiliating for me, but when mortality gets personal so suddenly, the thought of hell refuses to go away. I'm a good rationalist, but it hovers around, and a couple of bad nights give me a crash course in how it can colonize and infect the thought of dying. Worse, though, it's just your father gets home. That we each die alone and must work out our salvation in our own way. These seem most urgent spurs, no longer truisms at my new juncture. Shannon writes, had a breakdown, losing it, in the waiting room about the possibility of becoming phobic about IVs, which would make her life hell given all the IVs she is bound to get. Fear of pain. IVs a focal point for unexpressed feelings about the whole experience. But some it is the puncturing of one body layer and then another layer of pain inside, veins rolling around, rubbery and brittle from chemo, inescapable, being unable to just be passive, let it wash over her, her usual resource for dealing with pain. Meanwhile, the question of wanting things, being able to want and inhabit the life, the time, and loves I have, focuses acutely, and I'm not surprised that the organ where it seems to have taken up dwelling at this moment is the fingers. Not that I think of arresting the thread of life as it draws through them, but there's this hunger that feels like a skin hunger to handle every rough or silky twist of its passing. I understand it as and joining care to the material senses and to making stuff. Shannon writes, meanwhile, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The model of a true and revelatory relationship is the gratitude and tenderness between mother and child / teacher and student. The unique idea that you can tell if it's true by the feelings of tenderness and gratitude, not Oedipal-style envy, lack, violence. That this is also the relationship between you and the universal luminosity, which is also you. Some tension, as the models used are intersubjective, e.g. teacher-student, but non-dual. But E says non-dualism is mother's milk to me. The possibility that some passage of discontinuity like death can be the occasion of enlightenment if you do it right, i.e. if you can be in a place to recognize a love that is you and is also towards you. Thought of the panda as emblematic or somehow symbolic of Buddha for E, a stylized figure, not individualized, something that enables the recognition of personally specific things in, e.g., Hal and me, that are lovable, but it also de-individuates us, mother and or child, subject and or object. With my puritanical modernist aesthetic, I used to think it was embarrassing in a religion like Buddhism to have images of divinity scattered all over the landscape. It had that whiff of idolatry. But I was reading this book and I happened to look up and around my living room, and what were there? Like 12 or 15 stuffed pandas and pictures of pandas. Not because I view them as gods, not because I believe even in God like my belief mattered, but because seeing them makes me happy. Seeing self and others transmogrified through them, the presence, gravity, and clumsy comedy of these big, inefficient, contented, very endangered bodies, with all their sexual incompetence, and soot-black cookie-cutter ears. It seems so obvious that the more such images there are, the happier. And it means a lot to be happy. It may even mean to be good, ungreedy, unattached, unrageful, unignorant. Far different from the Pharisaism that says, I am lucky and happy because I am good, a modest occasional knowledge. I'm good if I am, because I'm lucky enough to be happy if I am. It never seems sensible to pass along moral injunctions. I sometimes think that beyond the golden rule, the only one that matters is this. If you can be happy, you should. Shannon writes, tests show no new cancer. Tests show same old cancer. Spinal pain remains, but some less. E working on how to live in relation to an incurable, not presently debilitating illness. Talking about the number of people who ask if her news is good or bad. That is not a flexible or productive way of thinking about this. And aim not to hope or fear a lot, not lead others to. Here's a Buddhist meditation I've read about. I can even do it. It happens in a public place. The substance of it is to recognize that every other person there, one by one, male and female, and young and old, has been, in some earlier life, your mother, or more likely, in many lives. And regarding the people one by one, you learn to understand how this could have been so. One by one, as you gaze, you can see what kind of mother they were to you. You can see as well, slowly, what kind of a child you were to them. Over and over and over, you're like Aeneas encountering a stranger, Venus, and guessing just from the rosy glow of their neck and their feet and the stately step, though too late, surely, stranger, you are a goddess. Surely, my mother. Shy as I am, I'm pretty good at this meditation. In almost every face, I can find the curve of a tenderness, however hidden, the place of a smile or an intelligence, a shared one. Aeneas, why am I never allowed to take your hand in mine, to hear your true voice and speak to you as you really are? Even in a skinhead without any lips to speak of, or in a girl who's anxious, anorexic, half-crazed with all her narcissistic burden, even from her I can elicit and nurture it, the sense of her possible, beautiful care of me. Indeed, of a compassion, of her imagination, or his. Of course, with babies, it's easy. In a room full of my students, I can find it. It's a therapy day, and I've driven up to the Gray building early for our hour. Early enough to clamber across the parking lot of the bank next door, across 9th Street to ask someone at the BP station on the corner a question about my car. But the shrubby border between the two parking lots is unexpectedly steep, mulched with its slippery pine needles. Typically clumsy, I tumble, almost fall. Then, collecting myself, move on through the bank's parking lot with all a fat woman's disavowing haste. After my errand, I'm walking back from the gas station when I notice Shannon rounding the corner of the Gray building. He's crossing the bank parking lot ahead of me and doesn't see me. When Nina and I were in the same high school, she bitterly accused me of embarrassing her by walking around alone, looking as if I was thinking. I don't know if that's how Shannon looks. I notice more the calm buoyancy with which he is able to steer his round, large, light body, like a float in a Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade. Even if he is thinking, he's alert to his surroundings. When he gets near the bottom of the shrubby border, suddenly the balloon makes a graceful low dip. I see him gather up from the pavement the clumps of pine mulch I kicked down as I was teetering on the brink. Then, bobbing up gently, he pats it back into place, his hands briefly smoothing it in with the other mulch. Me hanging back, wanting not to be seen. This little spied-on scene, how does it endow me with hidden treasure? Why do I feel afterwards as if, whatever my frustration or fear, I'm carrying with me an object of reflection? If I turn inward toward it, it will make me smile. I'm wary of such sudden condensations of sweetness, the kind that, in the past, have made me fall in love. But I don't resist either secretly fingering this enigmatic pebble. I can't quite figure out what makes its meaning for me. Diffident, I write to my email friend, Tim. There must be something inexhaustibly pleasing in the tight, light knot of space, time, and seeing. How the small extent of 9th Street, our wide-skied, Midwestern-feeling little college town, turns into a time-lapse graphic that lets Shannon occupy the place where I was, encountering my ghost without recognition, unmaking my mistake, me turning back, seeing it. And I love that his care for me was not care for me. Tim writes back, far from tedious, I find the image of Shannon bending over to pick up mulch, the same that you had dislodged in falling, if I understand you, not knowing it was you who had dislodged it, to have the power of something in De Quincey, or perhaps the film noir version of De Quincey that I carry around in my head. An immediate, involuntary substitution, anonymous shrinks doing reparative work in their spare time. Shannon writes, over a weekend, E got a call from a woman she has known here who just found out she too has breast cancer. E describes this woman as already having a significant depression. She describes someone to keep working even if she has no enjoyment in the labor. To me, this has something of the sound of how E used to be, in her not being able to stop. She remembers telling me how she waits for someone to tell her she can stop now, e.g., die. She imagines me doing this sometime in the future. She also talks about having come to be able to hear a voice like my voice inside herself when it is quiet, that she can trust and have confidence in. I can imagine the voice telling her she can stop.